So I'm just cleaning up the dashboard at the moment on the Stapley, getting ready to start staining the wood ahead of the varnish work. I'm basically cleaning up all the corners and the glue lines at the moment. Something I use quite often for that is a chisel, and I just use it as a scraper. I thought it was a good opportunity to show the technique, as it's something I do quite often. So I'll show you a bit more detail on how I use the chisel and the way I go about that. So the first thing to make sure is that you've got a nice sharp chisel with a good straight edge as well. You don't want a skewed edge or any nicks out of that, because as you scrape you're going to end up with little channels in the wood. So I've just redressed that on the Tormek, so we're good to go. So obviously you would conventionally use a chisel forwards in this direction, hammered or pushed with your hand from behind, but in this case we just want to take some real fine shavings. So what I'm actually going to be doing is pulling the chisel in a backwards direction at quite a high angle to the wood, and you can kind of gauge which angle is going to be best by just doing a couple of test passes. So if you go quite a shallow angle, it's not really going to do much. If you go too steep, it tends to kind of chatter a bit across the surface, so you want to be, let's say, around about sort of 35 to 45 degrees to the wood, and you want quite a bit of downward pressure. So I tend to push sort of on the end of the chisel here and take sort of passes like that. You're really not removing much material at all, but once you get to the corner where you're trying to remove your glue, which is higher than the wood, it will work quite well. And the reason I do this with glue lines, especially with epoxy, is that you've got a really hard area of epoxy there next to a soft area of wood. So if I try and sand that, sandpaper is just going to remove the wood and leave the epoxy in place, which is not what I want to do. I want a nice sharp finish into that corner, especially as this is in the dash area. So this is a good way of just finishing into a tight little corner like that and just removing a small amount of material at a time. So you can see you've just got fine little ribbons there, which is the white is the epoxy and the brown is the wood, of course. So we're just taking off a tiny little feather at a time. You want to be really careful not to angle the chisel, because if you come in at an angle like that, you're going to gouge the wood really quickly. An easier way around that is to use a wider chisel, or even a typical card scraper, which is actually the same kind of process that I'm doing here as how you would use a card scraper. But I've got some quite fine areas down either side here, so I'm using a narrow chisel, but I've got to be quite careful to keep it flat. Okay, so there's a shot of the finished top edge. So I find that method just helps you finish into a square corner quite nicely. If you were to try and do that with sandpaper, it's quite a tricky job, and I'd probably end up burning through the veneers on the dashboard, which I don't really want. There's a little shot of the shavings that typically come off. So the white is all epoxy, and then the brown is of course wood from the dash. So we're just taking off tiny little shavings basically. As I say, I find that a much easier method than sandpaper. So hope you found that little tip useful. Cheers guys, catch you next time.